Cool, here we go. Guys, welcome. Password policy in Drupal 8. This is GovCon 2015, correct? I do have the right place? Okay. Great, I'm starting off well. Perfect. Here's a little bit of an outline for what we're going to cover today. First, we're going to look at an introduction about what we're going to cover and how that works and where we're going with it. We're going to look at some password policy concepts so you guys kind of get a sense of what it was that I did and how I ported the module. Going to look at getting started and how I began to port the module and some thought processes there. Some lessons learned. I think those are the most important things that you guys are here for. We'll definitely cover those. A little bit of some architecture review around Drupal 8 and things that we discovered. Some pro tips, how I would classify those as what really you should get out of this presentation. And also how you can give back to password policy if you use it, extend it, so on and so on. And some thanks that I would like to call some people out that helped me to get from point A to point B. So a little bit about an introduction about me. I am a technical architect at Acquia. I've been using Drupal since Drupal 6 came out. I don't really know how many years. It's been several. I have a background in higher education before I came to Acquia. I am very much interested in Drupal 8 and DevOps and some continuous integration. Those are kind of my areas that I like to focus on. But my true passion is really teaching and enablement. I feel like all of those tools, Drupal 8 included, are just tools to help people do things better on the web and be better technologists. Password policy module. So what does it do? We have a picture of Adam's dog there to lead us into this. Password policy goals. So the main goal, the entire purpose of the module, is to constrain user passwords through policies and their respective constraints. A policy is defined by creating or updating passwords. So as you update your password on a Drupal site, the policies are meant to kick in and restrict you from entering certain passwords within the system, basically making sure you have strong passwords. The policy has one or more constraints that basically restrict attributes of a password. So these constraints comprise of the policy, and then that policy is assigned to one or more user roles. So as an example, we may have a length policy that has a minimum character length constraint and a maximum character length constraint. And those two constraints comprise of the policy, which is then assigned to a user role for enforcement. The architecture diagram looks a little something like this. We've got all the constraints that are on the right side of the diagram. Say, for instance, we have a length constraint or a complexity constraint or a character-driven constraint, and that all feeds into the policy. One other aspect of the policy is what we call a reset duration. There's ways that password policies can define how long a password can go before it needs to be reset. That's another constraint. And then that all feeds into a user role. So that user role then defines how a user, what restrictions a user has based on the role that they're assigned. Yeah?
So is the reset duration, is that an actual constraint? Is it like the same class or is it something different?
We'll talk about that.
Okay.
That's a great question. So we're going to use a little bit of terminology here throughout the presentation, and hopefully this will do a little recap of these concepts, and then it'll make a lot more sense as we go into Drupal 8 and how that all plays in. So we have the notion of constraint types. And a constraint type is basically the ability to have a similar constraint across multiple policies. So in the example of a character length constraint, we have some variables here in this sentence. We have X, minimum or maximum characters, and that's a constraint. So as an example of that, we could have 30 minimum characters. That would be really strong, right? and that's one constraint. It's almost like a Mad Lib, right? You can kind of fill in the little drop in your settings that you want, and there you go. So in this case, we have x, and x is a parameter for that specific constraint type. Minimum and maximum is also a parameter, but it's a selection. So you would pick minimum or maximum. Now we have password reset, and this will get to your question. So part of a policy, though, may not be an active enforcement. It may not be actually checking the password itself. Password reset is a constraint that says, that defines how frequently a user should reset their password. So this feature was actually defined in the D7 module, and it doesn't cleanly apply to the concept of a constraint type. So it's not being enforced when a user changes a password. It's being enforced, as we'll find later, based on time durations. Hi, welcome. Sorry, we got started. So this is a time-based constraint, but it's not a constraint that's doing active enforcement when a user changes his or her password. Because it really doesn't apply to the password itself. It applies to the duration between changes to that password. So there's a little bit of a different paradigm here that we're going to get into, and you'll see how those concepts apply to Drupal 8. Getting started. So when I started porting this module, this was the first module that I ported. I'd never used Drupal 8. I have no background. The purpose of this presentation is to walk you through exactly how I did that and what I learned from it and how to go about it the right way from the start. So really where I was coming from was, hey, I know how to build these modules in D7. It can't be all that hard in D8, right? Let's look at what the module design does in both cases, something a bit more generic. First, we know that we need to persistently store password policies, their constraints, and password reset settings for a policy. So we'll dive a little bit into best practices for how that storage should happen. In terms of module design, we're going to leverage hooks. We're going to do form alters on the user forms to tap into those events for password reset, or for password changing and updating, so on and so on. So that's the same as Drupal 7, right? Just do quick form alter and you're good to go. You could also leverage cron, Drupal's cron system, to provide that password reset enforcement. So cron runs every so often. If you could write some easy logic that says, hey, if a user has a password and their policy says that it should be reset after X number of days, enforce that when cron runs, and you can set the password expiration. And in terms of the module design, we've got this concept of these symphony events, which are sort of new to Drupal 8, but they're really worth noting in terms of like the actual design of the module. Is basically like looking at forcing the password to be reset when the user tries to perform an action on the site. And that happens across all requests. So the lower level you can get within Drupal 8, the better for performance. You don't want to incur more overhead. So if you can tap into Symfony in Drupal 8, that's the most ideal because that's the lowest level. So also in terms of the design, let's look at the concept of plugins in Drupal 8. So password policy is a really good example of how we can leverage the plugin system, which is brand new in Drupal 8. A policy in its bare form is just a collection of constraints. It's a wrapper, if you will. But constraint types, they should be logically extensible for your needs. They shouldn't be prescriptive. So D8's plugin API is the perfect mechanism for building a flexible architecture around constraint types. It basically allows modules to extend password policy behaviors and constraints by creating their own constraint types. So if you don't like what you see, you can really easily, inside of your own module, create your own. So I did this as a proof of concept for the password policy ZXCVBN module. I thought I would stammer that out during my presentation. I actually did okay. This module is a classic example of how you can improve your module development in Drupal 8. Why? Because this module alone consists of just a plugin. And that plugin provides a new constraint type for the ZXCVBN password library. So now, by enabling that module, that constraint type is turned on, and any policy that you write for your passwords can take advantage of it. Pretty cool, right? I thought so. So what about my first attempt at doing this module inside of Drupal 8? First and foremost, I leveraged way too many Drupal 7 concepts. And you still can. You have a module file inside of Drupal 8. You have the ability to do hooks and all kinds of things that are identical to what you can do in Drupal 7. So what are some things that I did? Well, first, everything was database driven. I had custom tables for the policies, custom tables for the constraints, custom tables for their settings, so on and so on. And I used the standard form API. I cranked them out and had a bunch of form alters. It was very procedural in nature. And I'm like, hey, cool, I got my D8 module working. All right. What did I actually take advantage of in D8 in my first attempt? Well, I did a lot of simple YAML stuff. I looked at permissions and menus and routes, installation settings, things like that, because you have to do that, right? Those are the replacements for things that are in D7. I also looked at and leveraged many of the core provided classes and interfaces around forms and the plugins, as we talked about, automated tests. So I was able to take advantage of some of that. There was some good documentation online, and so I rolled that into my first attempt. Thought it was cool. I did create some automated tests, as I mentioned. I built a custom plugin system, which had a service built on top of it so that you could invoke the plugins and pull out the constraints, constraint types across any module that extends it. And I leveraged the Symfony events for that user login enforcement around password reset. So if your password was to be reset, I did find a way, in my first attempt to enforce that through Symfony. So that was cool. Highly recommend you guys look at events in Symfony. But this is the fun part. What lessons did I learn? And this is really about reflecting on how I really didn't build a Drupal 8 port. I built a very hacky Drupal 7 port into Drupal 8. And why is that? What are some flaws with the attempt? Let's take a step back and review that. First and foremost, be mindful that it is absolutely possible to make use of Drupal 7 concepts, but I guarantee you this makes for a very crappy Drupal 8 port. That I can assure you. Drupal 8 is object-oriented, and it is not meant to be procedural. There's nothing about it except for some of the hooks that are delivered with Drupal 8 that is meant to be procedural. Database content, this is huge. Database content is not exportable. It's meant to be content, right? So the database API and all the tables that I wrote for the policies and the constraints and the constraint types, I couldn't leverage any of the cool configuration management and the exportables that came with Drupal 8. Totally shot myself in the foot. Another kind of cool thing that I totally neglected was the notion of entities inside of Drupal 8. Whenever I wrote in password reset, I did it in a very procedural way. I used the database tables to track users and when their password should be reset. But the problem with that is that really didn't leverage any sort of entity architecture. And you would say, well, why would I want to do that? Why you would want to do that is because, again, it's exportable and it uses configuration management. And those are strong tools to adopt so that your module has a better architecture. So what could have I done differently with the password reset? I should have extended the user entity with some custom fields and adopted that entity and then used CMI to export those fields out. We'll get into that later. The code was overtly complex, right? Tons of procedural code, lots of hooks, not proper use of controllers or anything like that. So that was a major flaw. It actually made the module extremely complex, a lot of technical debt, because I wasn't taking advantage of what Drupal 8 was providing me. One other thing I learned is that enabling a module enables all of its plugins that are in the namespace. But what happens if you don't want all of those plugins to be enabled? What happens if you don't want every single constraint type that exists in the system? How do you get around that? We'll learn that here shortly. And one thing that I've learned now after doing several module ports is that a lot of the D8 ports that I am doing now are very, very lean in their code. Extremely pared back. The last one I did, I was telling these guys earlier, was about 68% of the Drupal 7 code was in the D8 port and was fully functional. So if it's done right, you're really boosting velocity by leveraging Drupal 8, and you have something that doesn't have as much technical debt. So how do you really do that? You leverage all the core provided interfaces and classes. That is how you do that. And you learn how to do that properly. So that meant that my initial port was really hefty and very bloated. So what does a more appropriate Drupal 8 port look like? Well, first, heavy use of objects, lean use of hooks. The hook should always be total bare minimum because you're introducing procedural code. Absolutely use config entities over database transactions. If there's one thing you get out of it, use configuration entities, period. How can you do that well and do that properly? Well, first, you can use Drupal console to generate these entities for you. You don't have to know how to do it by hand. Also take a look at config schemas and the associated config forms. Config schemas are a new concept in D8. It's YAML based, but it is incredibly powerful and it is fully exportable. So that mechanism, in my mind, is worth reviewing. Also, the use of controllers and services. Drupal 8 it has some really powerful stuff with invoking controllers for private functions that exist within a module. And the use of services are global across Drupal 8. So basically, if you extend if your module has services that it exposes, any other module can take advantage of it. So it's pretty nice. Plugins are also really cool. But what's more appropriate to do with the plugin? Well, if you don't want the plugin to always be turned on, consider putting it in a submodule. Or consider putting it in a completely different contrib module altogether. Because that way then someone can turn that module on or turn it off at their own discretion. They don't have it shipped with everything. So let's get into some details here, okay? First and foremost, services are globally available from your module, if you develop it, throughout the entire application, okay? So this is registered inside your module's services.yaml file. And to invoke that, so for instance, in the encrypt module that I'm building, the port, I created a service called encryption. So to invoke that, you have the Drupal global namespace. You invoke that, call the service, call the encryption service, just like you're seeing here on the slide, and it has an encrypt function that is delivered with that service that can return to you an encrypted string in one line of code. So what else is cool about Drupal 8? Well, first and foremost, because it leverages PSR 0 and PSR 4, the namespacing ideas inside of Drupal 8 are extremely powerful. Everything that's defined in your module source directory is I use the word automatically, but automatically registered when inside of the namespaces that Drupal recognizes. So some classic examples of that are, if you put a class inside of source form, it's going to know that that is a form. Kind of a cool concept, right? Do you have to put that in a YAML file or an info file somewhere? No. It automatically understands what it is. Pretty cool, right? So the same applies for different events, like I talked about Symphony, right? There's a source event subscriber. There's automated tests go under source tests. So all of these namespaces are really cool because then you don't have to worry about making sure that your class is registered somewhere and that all the configuration's right. It basically automatically does it. Pretty neat. One of the key things, as we keep coming back to over and over again, is a lot of the things that you should be building into your Drupal 8 port should be objects. Take advantage of the object orientation. That's really where you can get the biggest bang for your buck. Leverage and extend core provided classes. This is really the hardest part, to be honest with you. We'll get into some tips and tricks later that you guys can help to get a little bit better about that. But also leverage things like interfaces and base classes, controllers, entities. Wrap yourself and immerse yourself in the different types of objects that exist inside of Drupal. Because if you do that, I guarantee you, your ports are going to be better architecturally and they're going to be better adopted. If you look at things like in Drupal 7, there was custom callbacks and custom functions that would exist inside of a module file or an include file, right? Does that sound familiar to anybody? That stuff should all be baked into a controller in Drupal 8. And that controller then belongs to the module. So you're invoking a class that belongs to the module itself instead of putting a weird underscore or naming it a certain way or trying to figure out how to follow conventions that are very ad hoc. This is very structured. It's very clean. And everybody in Drupal 8 knows what a controller is. Yeah.
In a
Hopefully.
previous session that I went to, I heard about this tool that is going to help you convert your Drupal 7 module into your Drupal 8 module. Now, I'm guessing that that's probably not going to do anything with the object-oriented capabilities, correct?
It does, but let's talk about that in a few minutes because you're going to see something that will be absolutely relevant to what you just asked. I promise you. So hang tight if you don't mind. I promise I will get back to that. And I will answer the question directly on a certain slide. Cool. All right. So what's the really cool thing about entities? Well, first and foremost, they are highly extensible in Drupal 8. Okay? You can create your own fields. Most of them are exportable. All of these things that you don't like about Drupal 7, these entities are now providing functionality that you want. And if you really want to solve those problems, you should be using these things. So you can create your own fields for existing entities, things like users or files or all these system entities that Drupal provides. You can extend them within your own module. It's kind of cool. So the user reset attribute that we talked about before, and I originally built that as a database table that had logic and a timestamp field and all this other stuff, right? Well, that shouldn't be a database table. Those attributes of when a password should be reset belongs to the user, right? So extend the entity. It's a different mindset, right? Very, very different. So you can create these fields within the Drupal interface on the back end. You can use CMI to export those fields as YAML, and you can place your YAML file right into your config install directory, which is a predefined area in a module, to install that the minute your module gets enabled. Super simple. Yeah.
So, I get it. It's cool that you don't have to create a database table. Behind the scenes, is it appending it to the existing table, or is it creating a new table?
That's a great question. So behind the scenes, it leverages the schema.yaml file to define its storage component. When you do a field inside of Drupal, you select what that field type is. Maybe it's a string, or it's a number, or it's a date. And Angie covered a lot of those, different types that Drupal 8 ships with. You pick that type, and it actually produces that schema for you. So when you produce that YAML file, it basically stubs out that schema that you need. And if you audit that, you can see exactly what the entity schema looks like. And you could override it if you want. Yeah.
So with Drupal 8, when you're extending these things and it's creating schema and doing all this, will you still be able to say, look at the database like in PHP, MyAdmin, or whatever, and be able to figure out what it's done, or is it going to be just,
Well,
spaghetti? I mean, what is it going to look like?
That's a great question. I think I would answer that slightly differently than how you might want me to answer that. I would actually say that Drupal itself provides the wrapper on top of how the actual data gets stored. And that's the logic that it's providing for you. My gut would tell me that it may not be a great decision to be looking through the database itself. As Angie mentioned, there are different ways that CMI can be configured. One of which is direct to the file system, and the other is in the database. So I think the role of the database is downplayed, and it may not be the best decision to go directly to the database when debugging a problem or looking how it's stored. But I think the CMI layer actually handles that a lot for you and provides a wealth of functionality that you should take advantage of.
But if I did
Yes.
look at the database, am I going to be able to figure out what it's done?
I think so. I think it's very similar to how Drupal 7 is set up with different fields and different components. And each field in Drupal 7 has its own revisions table and instances table. I'm not sure if that's a direct pair to what's in Drupal 8, but from what I can tell so far, there are definitely different tables per field, and the storage mechanism, if you're caching it in the database, is maintained that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's concerning, but it makes sense.
Sure. Let me put it this way. I don't think it's rapidly divergent from what is in 7 at the moment. That's what my gut tells me. That's probably not a great answer for you, though. I'm sorry. So let's take a look at what I did in password policy as kind of an architectural review of all the fun D8-ness that I took advantage of. And we've kind of talked a lot about these already, so this should just be mostly review. But for the policies and the constraint types, we looked at leveraging config entities and config forms. We looked at the config schemas that are needed for that, and that goes under config schema and schema.yaml file. We leveraged the CMI, the Configuration Management Initiative, and this is really for a lot of persistent storage around basically anything that's not content in nature. So this does limit the use of the database API. The database API exists in Drupal 8. So don't feel like I'm saying, hey, it's all gone and you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that I believe that this is a stronger way to build your module. Also, just to review, we extended system entities that already was shipped with Drupal 8 to do my module define needs and module define fields for those entities. And definitely learn how to use this schema-based storage because it's really cool. It's totally worth it. Services and plugins, these are really powerful features that we're taking advantage of with my port. The plugin manager as a service has its own interface that's defined so that other modules can extend it. We'll get to that. And there's a base class for some automated functions that if you don't want to override it, you can take advantage of the functionality that's delivered with the base class. Also, with the global provided Drupal invocation, that helps you to tap into these services and get to the containers that you need inside of Drupal 8 to be dangerous. And one of the core things to summarize is really that the core provided interfaces and classes, they perform a lot of the legwork of this module, believe it or not. And that's something that if you know how to take advantage of, it delivers a ton of out-of-the-box functionality. So how did I figure out how to do this in Drupal 8? And I think that's the million-dollar question. So learning these tools, learning the tools that Core provides, in my opinion, is really tricky. Right now, it's still in active development, right? Drupal 8 hasn't been released yet. So some things are changing ongoing. So if you learn something, you might have to relearn it. The D.O documentation hasn't really kept up with active development, to be honest. That's my opinion. But there's not a ton of actual like use cases and documentation around how these core interfaces and classes should be implemented. So that's a challenge, right? I see that obviously getting better with time, but you need a release. So it's not always clear what the purpose or use of the tools that are delivered with Drupal 8 core. It's just not obvious sometimes. So learning this takes time, right? But one of the best things, honestly, that you can do is to look at core for how it leverages its design patterns. So if you find something in core that you want to do, you can go and snoop around in its code and see exactly how it was implemented. I know that that sounds obvious, but honestly, that is an extremely powerful tool. And it also helps with learning the namespaces and the way that modules need to be built. You have obvious examples that are shipping with Drupal 8 right now, and they work, right? So what else can you do? Well, you could look at PHP Storm. It provides some nice functionality in terms of a code editor that you can hit the Shift key twice and do a global search over all of the classes and interfaces provided by Drupal. So if I want to search for something like Ajax, it'll give me a list of all the classes that have the name Ajax in it, in a wildcard sort of way. So after finding these classes, then it may make sense to go onto Drupal.org and look at some of the documentation around that class and how it's being used and invoked and referenced throughout other parts of core or other parts of code that you find. That's when your Google searches get a lot more dangerous, right? If you found something that is super relevant. So this is really helpful for determining possible examples that you could take advantage of that exist within core. So we're getting into a little bit of the pro tips. There are absolutely better ways to do this that you need to be aware of. And I'm going to answer your question in 2 seconds here. So some tips for porting. First and foremost, start fresh. Don't try working directly off of the Drupal 7 code. Now, you had mentioned the module porting, right? These are tools that can really help to set a very base level Drupal 8 module. It creates some controllers with custom functions that are defined in the module file or in the includes. It is smart enough to do that. It is smart enough to convert some things like forms and routes. So it does have some object orientation. However, in the examples that I have seen, it does not adequately apply the Drupal 8 concepts. It does a port, but it's not necessarily porting it with a fresh perspective. And that fresh perspective, in my opinion, is invaluable to taking advantage of the Drupal 8 features. Because most of the Drupal 8 concepts are not a one-to-one mapping to something in Drupal 7. Something automated cannot do that automatically for you. So it requires your intervention and your discretion on how you want to use those features. Yes?
Generally speaking, how does your knowledge of Drupal 7 translate into Drupal 8? Like, so you're up here on the Drupal 7 learning curve.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you going to be on the Drupal 8 learning curve? Are you going to be back at the beginning again? Or are you going to
No. I think the minute you get your head around namespacing and object orientation and the difference between YAML files and like the info files and other ways that module configuration is done, I think your learning curve is drastically lessened. Because you get the ideas then, right? Because then you could take your Drupal 7 knowledge and then basically say, oh, okay, well, I know this namespace exists for doing a form.
Yeah, I was thinking more of the API and stuff itself, not so much object-oriented programming.
Oh, I see. Okay, so you mean like core provided functions and things like that?
How much of it is similar, or is it? I know YAML, the info in YAML files. I mean, that's different.
Yeah, I think speaking to why I have services mentioned a lot in here is that all of the core provided functionality is defined through service models now. So if you really get your head around what services exist and list out the services and understand how you can invoke them, and how you can debug them a little bit, I really think that that translates very cleanly to what core provides. Because core exposes a bunch of different services that you leverage inside of all your modules that you develop. So I think really focusing on services would be advantageous for that. One of the things that really I think cannot be understated is the notion of planning. I think sometimes as a developer, it's really cool just to jump in and really go crazy and start coding. But if you really try to understand the concepts around Drupal 8 and you try to thoughtfully put together how you would construct a module using some of the new ideas, I think you'd be surprised about how much better your module is going to be. So, take the hour or hour and a half to sit down and just kind of stub out, like, this is how I want to do services. This is how I want to do plugins. This is how I want to take advantage of entities or existing entities that are in the system. Really would just kind of make your life a lot easier, and I think your port would be a lot stronger. So we talked about leveraging core. So core provides a crap ton of design patterns that it ships with and how it uses things like blocks and settings and plugins and services. And those are things you can look at and really get a sense of what's going on. So study the actual system itself and try to find these features you want to poach for your own use case. One of the things that I've found invaluable is actually looking at the automated tests that ship with core modules. That shows you what they are doing in various use cases with the core provided interfaces. So if you find something that you think is useful, like an AJAX response or some sort of form base or some sort of class that is derived with configuration, well, take a look and see what the automated tests are doing. You can understand exactly what that functionality is supposed to provide. So that's invaluable because everything in core has automated tests. So that can't fail you. And then, you can also audit the core code that provides that behavior, do your own code review of it, and identify some similar functionality you may want to grab from it. And review some of the namespaces that are in core and how those classes are invoked within those core modules. Drupal console. This is really cool. So like if you're just starting out and you want to learn some basics about stubbing out module code, this is the place to do it. So Drupal console is not Drush. It is not running commands on a live Drupal site. It's really not intended to do that. Really what it does is helps you produce boilerplate code for your Drupal 8 module. So for instance, say you want a new configuration entity. Drupal console provides a command line tool with steps to help you walk through how to build one. And it creates the code for you. You don't even have to worry about the namespaces. Super powerful. And it'll even stub out the configuration schema and everything that I mentioned in my presentation around entities and so on and so on. So this is a huge time saver for creating Drupal 8 components in your module. Massive time saver. So this can create config entities. This can create forms. This can create services. I mean, there's tons of features that are rolled into Drupal console. They've already thought it up for you. And for Drupal 8 not being released yet and having a tool like this, it's pretty slick. It also has commands for doing a lot of the configuration management. Things like you can edit configuration. You can debug configuration. It's on a live site, right? You can override it using that console tool. It's pretty cool. And there's a URL to the console. Yeah.
So that bit sounds very drushy to me. That's interacting with live site, right?
It is, yeah. But it's meant more for DevOps. Okay. Is probably a better way to look at it. But I think the most powerful part about it really is the code generation. That's my opinion. Use it all the time. Like, all the time. PHP Storm is an awesome text editor if you really want to get your head around this object orientation and some of these new concepts. It inherently supports object-oriented code formatting and syntax highlighting, which can be really beneficial when you're starting out. It identifies missing or undefined class references for you, which is super cool because then you don't have to worry about getting runtime errors. You can see it because it was undefined in your code. So that's kind of neat. And you could also press Command click on one of those missing references, and it does a nice little modal window and asks you which one you want to include, if it can find it. So that's kind of nice too. We talked about this, but pressing the Shift key twice in PHP Storm lets you do a wildcard search of classes all through the site. Any files that start with Ajax or contain the term Ajax or any other search term you want to try to find. That's really good for trying to find those core classes that I mentioned. Command click on a class loads its associated contents. This one I pulled from Chris Vanderwater gave me, and I actually haven't really leveraged this a whole lot. But it also has full integration with Drupal coder standards and PHP CS, which is really nice. So then you don't have to worry about your code being terribly off if you submit it up to Drupal.org or otherwise. A lot of continuous integration tools, check for these sorts of things anyway. So
I just wanted to ask about the command click on class. So you're saying that if you are writing a class where you implement an interface, if you command click on it, it'll pull all of its methods into your file.
Oh no, I'm sorry. That's probably poorly worded. I'm glad you asked. So like if you're actually calling a class inside of your module and you hover over that class and do command click, it will open the actual file where that class code resides, and you can see exactly what that code is doing. Yeah, sorry, that was poorly worded on the slides. And PHP Storm has inherent integration with Git and some other code versioning tools. So like you kind of get that for free. It's kind of nice. Giving back. So because we've made certain architectural decisions with password policy, it can be extensible. Very much extensible. And I'm encouraging you to give that back to the community because other people may want to take advantage of that. So how do I sign up? Well, first and foremost, I would actually appreciate if people would download and submit issues and give me feedback on the module as it is right now. Right now, the GitHub link that I have here is probably the most up-to-date, but we do periodic releases back to D.0 once certain features are baked and we feel confident it's ready for another release. But it is the 8.x-3.x-dev branch on D.0. But contribute your own constraint types. So if you find ways that you want to extend password policy for your own use case, build your own constraint type. Throw that up on a new module in Drupal.org and give that back to the community. Someone else may want that, and it's a really, really easy way for you to contribute your own password constraints back to others that may want to use it. So I have to give some folks some credit because definitely there's no way that I would have been able to do any of this if it wasn't for some folks. Chris Vanderwater, Clips GC, he's a core contributor in D8, works at Acquia. Guy's super sharp and was very helpful. Tim Plunkett, also same deal. Megan Williams was part of a Drupal 8 learning initiative that I participated in Acquia. Having that opportunity that she provided me was great. Aurelian was awesome for consulting and looking at and testing the module and helping debate its architecture merit. That was really cool. Alex Knoll, a peer of mine who has been really helpful for evaluating some Drupal 8 concepts and just hearing me out when I need to brainstorm. And a thank you to all of the folks that have given and contributed back to this new awesome system that I think is really cool, both in the form of code and documentation. I think folks are, once they get their head around Drupal 8, it's going to be mind-blowing and they're going to love it. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. I really appreciate it, and I'll be here to answer any questions. I know you guys have been doing that ongoing. I appreciate your engagement, and I'll be here to take any questions or help out as needed. I'll be here through Friday. Thanks.